Well, ever since humanity can remember, there's always been this sense of a struggle between good and evil. In fact, this struggle really always seems to be at the center of our most epic stories, right? Recently, our youngest son has been reading through the Harry Potter series, and in light of that, he inspired some family movie binge watching of the Harry Potter movies over March break. And if you're at all familiar with Harry Potter, isn't that the same struggle right at the heart of the Harry Potter story? Constantly wrestling through the question of who will win, Harry or Voldemort, good or evil. In this episode, in this battle, and even within all of our own very souls. Well, as we near the end of our community journey and study through the book of Revelation, it's this same epic struggle that begins to reach its climax in the biblical story. Now, it's always important, though, for us to remember that Revelation isn't just a standalone book, but is part of the ancient library of books that we know of as the Bible, which tells one large story together. And while Revelation kind of uniquely paints part of the picture of the biblical story to come, it is also this ongoing telling and retelling of the story so far, all while providing a unique camera angle or lens on our stories right here and right now. All in fantasy drama, sort of Harry Potter-like fashion. So with all that in mind, to help us prepare to understand the part of the story we're looking at today in Revelation chapter 20, we actually need to have a brief review of the very beginning of the biblical story, where the Bible begins to first answer the questions, where does evil come from? And will good or evil ultimately prevail in the story? So turning back to the third chapter of the Bible, right at the very beginning, after God fashions all of creation and emphatically declares it all as very good, we read this in chapter 3, Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, where it says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made." Now, if you're familiar with the story at all or the creation account, this becomes the moment where evil enters the story through the character of the serpent. And I want to be clear that this story and this creation account isn't about trying to debate the literal nature or legitimacy, of talking snakes, any more than we would debate the talking snakes of Harry Potter. But it is about making us aware of a distortion and a deception that emerges early in the story of God's good creation, that at times is very tangible and even personified like it is here. And this is the entry of evil into the story through the serpent that ends up deceiving Adam and Eve into believing that they can't fully trust the goodness of God, and then find themselves falling into humanity's first act of rebellion against God, all in the midst of God's otherwise good and perfect creation. Now, this may raise for us the question of why would a good and perfect God even allow this to happen? Why would evil be allowed to slither its way into God's good and perfect creation in the first place? And while these are complex questions, I believe the answer that the Bible points toward is that out of God's good and perfect love, God has made all of creation with the capacity to exercise and enjoy radical free will. Capable of either reciprocating or rejecting God's love for us, and therefore making all manner of things, including evil, possible in our world. But then to further prepare us for our passage in Revelation today, what we also need to see and need to know right here from the beginning of the story is that even before evil is a day old, the Bible includes a promise that then points toward the story to come. Where in Genesis 3:14 and 15, it says this, it says, "Then the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, because you have deceived humanity, I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." And then listen to this. And then it says, "And he will crush your head." That the crafty and deceptive serpent will be crushed. That nearly as fast as evil arrives on the scene, we encounter a promise from the very voice of God that good will eventually and ultimately triumph over evil. So with that bit of backdrop from the third chapter of the Bible, I want to now invite us to turn to the third last chapter of the Bible that we're going to be looking at today in Revelation chapter 20. And you could follow along if you have a Bible with you or a Bible app. And while we won't look at every single verse here in detail, we're going to walk through the main themes of this chapter to see what part of the story God is telling here. Where Revelation chapter 1 begins this way with the author John writing this. He says, and I saw an angel. And we're actually going to stop right there for a moment because this is a key phrase that we've seen before in Revelation. In fact, we've seen it 6 times before, and now this is the 7th time where John writes it just this way, and I saw an angel. And this phrase and the number of times that John uses it is actually a clue to remind us that Revelation isn't a prediction of, literal or linear future events, but is actually a description of these overlapping heavenly visions that John saw. And John's use of this reoccurring segue lets us know that John isn't trying to map out a sequence of history, but is simply describing what he saw in the heavenly realm as he saw it. As one scholar says, with this 7th vision, essentially representing the symbolic culmination of all the interrelated and overlapping visions we've seen so far in the first 6. So what did John see in this 7th vision? Well, it says, and I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. Now, doesn't that sound like a scene, straight out of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire? But friends, here's the cool thing. In the beginning here of John's 7th vision, which really sets up these last 3 chapters of Revelation, that in John's apocalyptic writing style, this is essentially John's vision of the Genesis 3 promise of the serpent, the source of all evil, being crushed. As he says that he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, bound and locked away. See, these are essentially all the words and descriptions used to describe the source of evil throughout the scriptures. Introduced as the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, and then named and described and personified as the devil, which literally means the deceiver, or the Satan, which means the accuser, in the Hebrew language or throughout the Hebrew tradition. And then depicted as the dragon throughout the book of Revelation, making clear here that this is the moment that good is ultimately triumphing over all sources of evil, as the one who comes down from heaven seizes and locks away the serpent who has been the deceiver and source of all evil in the world. Now, one of the great debates that tends to happen over this passage has to do kind of with the when or specific timeline of these events, particularly around the phrase 1,000 years. But this tends to be, and scholars would say this tends to become a misguided debate because this is where it's critical to remember that John's visions are saturated with symbolism and that every number essentially in Revelation is symbolic. And that because of the symbolism, so many of these visions, they hint as much toward things that God has already done in the story so far, as they do as hinting toward things that God will do one day in the story to come. And in that light, we can actually see and understand this cosmic defeat and crushing of the serpent as something that God has already done in Jesus. In fact, many scholars make this very observation in how, Jesus himself, he spoke of his earthly ministry as though it was going to be this act of binding Satan in a parable he told in Matthew 12, verse 29. Or then in how Jesus described what was going on in the mission of his disciples, where he said he saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning in Luke 10:18-19. And then most significantly, through what the early church understood Jesus accomplished on a cosmic scale through the cross, based on how Jesus had said he would drive out the ruler of the world, drive out the evil one through his crucifixion in John 12:31-33. Now, to help us kind of picture all of this and get our head around these theological concepts, check out this 14th century painting here that is sometimes referred to as the Harrowing of Hell. Now, what you can see in this painting, right in the middle, obviously, is the risen Jesus, actually right in the midst of the darkness, and he's taking Adam and Eve by their wrist to show that he's doing all the work. They're representing all humanity, that he's pulling them out from the clutches of death. All while the saints, the followers of Jesus, both past and present on both sides, are looking on with anticipation and excitement. But most specific to our passage today from Revelation, what I want you to notice is the disfigured looking reddish brown character right at the bottom and middle of the image, beneath Jesus's feet, this character that's bound and tied amidst the broken locks of hell, symbolizing Satan being bound and chained because of Jesus's death and resurrection. And in fact, what's interesting in some other medieval portrayals of this same scene is there's various versions of this similar painting. Some of them depict the gates of hell, those are the two boards you saw there at the bottom, actually falling in the form of a cross, kind of on Satan who is bound and crushed, demonstrating how God has already accomplished the crushing of the serpent through Jesus' death on the cross. This is what John sees as he begins seeing this seventh vision toward the end of Revelation. And then as John continues, he describes another remarkable cosmic feature of what Jesus has already accomplished through his death and resurrection, where he says in verse 4, he says, "I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. They will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years." Now, if we go back to the Harrowing of Hell painting for a moment, we can throw it back up there for a moment. I want you to notice what we see on the heads of the saints on the left side of the painting, left of Jesus and how we're looking. And you see the crowns that are on their heads. And this is kind of an odd image, an odd symbolism, given that Jesus' original followers and most of John's original audience would have lived their lives under the severe oppression and persecution and impoverishment of the rulers of their day. Many of them actually being killed by the kings and rulers of the Roman Empire. However, during Jesus' life and ministry, Jesus was constantly announcing that he had come to start a new kind of kingdom. And that people that would put their trust in him, that his followers, people following his way in this sort of upside down kingdom kind of way, would be given this humble and servant-hearted role to play in helping build and establish his kingdom here on earth. And that's why what John sees in Revelation here is Jesus' followers, some who had already been killed because of their faith, now reigning with a new kind of authority in heaven. And he sees Jesus' followers who are still living on earth, kind of serving or reigning as these priests of God. All as a renewal of God's original mandate in Genesis 1 for humans to lovingly rule over creation, to steward and care for creation. And here as a picture of how the Apostle Peter described the church as a chosen people and royal priesthood in 1 Peter 2. This is all kind of what John is seeing on a cosmic scale in this seventh vision that really begins these last 3 chapters of the book of Revelation. So with all that, let me just recap what we've heard, or more accurately, what we've seen with John so far in Revelation 20. That through his death, Jesus has crushed and bound the serpent, the source of all evil. And then by his risen spirit, Jesus has given his followers this servant ruler role to be a part of establishing his kingdom here on earth as in heaven, his good and loving kingdom, all as part of the revelation of God's story so far. But friends, then this probably begs the questions, like, what about the evil in the world that still rages all around us? Maybe thinking of some of the most severe and significant evils in our world, just some of the kinds of things we took a few moments to pray for together this morning. Or what about more, close to home, the evil that still at times finds its way slithering into my heart and my life? And where is all of this going in the story to come? Well, from here, let's keep reading, picking up in verse 7, where it says this. It says, "When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city that God loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them." Now, friends, I know this is one of the more startling scenes here in Revelation, but let's always remember that John's visions here are symbolic and metaphoric to help us see a deeper truth beyond the surface. And with that in mind, to our questions, about the evil all around us, especially if Jesus has already crushed the serpent, what we can see here in light of the story to come, according to the larger biblical story, is that we actually find ourselves currently living in what biblical scholars would describe as the already and not yet. The already and not yet, that God has already triumphed over evil through Jesus, and that God has not yet brought all of that to fruition, has not yet fully established his kingdom of goodness and love here on earth, as he promises to do one day through Jesus' return. Having some describe or think about evil and maybe the role of the evil one kind of like this, that you could imagine, the devil as this mob boss who's already been captured and defeated and locked away, has lost the battle and been locked in prison, but still has enough connections and influence to still be causing havoc and chaos, beyond the walls of his own cell, on the outside in the world we live in today. And it's out of that understanding that today's passage, it begins to paint this symbolic picture of part of the not yet story to come. Suggesting that any influence that Satan still has or will be permitted or released to have is only enough to eventually culminate in self-destruction. As again, it says in that part that we just read from, of how, Satan will gather his armies from all four corners of the earth. It's again a symbol of gathering all of God's enemies, all of the principalities and powers of evil, as though they're getting ready for this emerging battle. And again, this is now the third time we've seen a scene like this, where we already saw this emerging battle in Revelation 16 and Revelation 19. But once again, we see the recurring, surprising twist of no battle needing to be fought. Only we get to see the full and final divine destruction of evil, all of which has already been initiated and guaranteed by the battle that Jesus has already won on the cross. All of which leads to the final scene here in Revelation 20 with more of the story to come, where it says in verse 11, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books." So here we have a picture of what's often referred to as the final judgment. That God will one day raise all people to fulfill his good and perfect judgment and justice for the world. And friends, it's a reminder here that what we do in this life matters. What we do with our deeds and with our lives has an impact, has an effect, has an eternal significance. The New Testament says that when it comes to faith in Jesus, we aren't saved by our works or deeds, but we are saved for works and deeds, and that our deeds are a reflection of our faith, of where we are putting our trust. That everything we do is either contributing to the slow and steady establishment and building of God's kingdom of goodness and love, or is contributing to the destined for destruction evil of the serpent. And I know that can be an unnerving thought, because who among us hasn't at times contributed, or may in our lives still find ourselves contributing to evil, to un-Jesus-like deeds? And yet that's what makes it so critical for us to notice another very intentional and clever detail right here in this part of John's vision. We're going back into it as first he writes this. He writes that books were opened. Books, plural, as in lots of books, as in enough books for everyone who has ever lived. Biographies and stories of every human life. The moment where what Jesus described as all things that are hidden being disclosed. Essentially a record of all of humanity has ever done to be reviewed and evaluated according to God's standard of goodness and love. But then it says another book was opened, the book of life. That the countless records of humanity's deeds don't end up having the last word in God's judgment or evaluation. That while God indeed has a standard that he's invited all of humanity to embrace, God also has a salvation that is eager to embrace all of humanity. And what's interesting is that this isn't actually the first time we've heard of the book of life in Revelation, as it's been mentioned a couple of other times and as was introduced once with a little more description of what this book is much earlier in Revelation 13:18, where it says this. It says, "The book of life belongs to the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." And you see, the books of the final judgment of Revelation 20, reveal the deeds we've all done. The book of life tells the story and reveals the deeds of someone else. The deeds and the story of the Lamb since the foundation of the world, the beginning of time, before any of us had done any of our deeds. That the book of life is the story of the Lamb, the story of Jesus, the story of salvation, which God has been writing since the beginning of the world, the story that has the power to redeem and forgive and renew all of humanity's sin and evil. And it is the story and the point of this passage that will one day deal with and destroy all evil for good. And that's how Revelation 20 concludes, where it says in verse 14, "Afterwards, death and its kingdom were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Anyone whose name wasn't written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire." Now, two really important notes on this part of the vision, on this part of the description of the story to come. First is that what is crystal clear is that John sees a future where God will bring an end to evil once and for all time. That death, evil's really last line of defense and most significant instrument, it will die its own death, never to rise, never to live again. And then second, it's clear that anything else that could potentially threaten or steal life from humanity, anything that could ever tempt or try to deceive humanity into not seeing and trusting God's goodness for what it is, it will be consumed as though in fire, never to rear its ugly head again. And friends, while that is good news, I know some of these images can also feel unsettling as well. And I want to say that while the Bible isn't quite as crystal clear on how exactly this might play out for anyone, as our English text reads, who might want to fully reject God's goodness and love, there's one final note about this passage that I want to point out this morning that I find quite fascinating, and frankly also reminds us that we are not quite yet at the end of the story, that there is still more of the story of Revelation to come. And that fascinating note is just how the images here of both fire and water throughout Revelation tend to be so overlapping. I mean, here in this passage describing this lake of fire, which is an overlapping image, but again, more than that, throughout the scriptures and throughout this story. Perhaps most notably for Revelation, as in one of John's favorite Old Testament texts that he alludes to or quotes from often in Daniel chapter 7, where the prophet Daniel has a very similar vision of the throne of God or that final judgment, but where he sees a river of fire, a bright and glorious river of fire flowing from the throne of God. But that we're going to see soon in the upcoming pages that John then sees differently. John then re-envisions or reimagines as a river of the water of life flowing from the throne of the Lamb in Revelation 22, verse 1. And then perhaps kind of on this note, most significant, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but what we'll see in our final week of Revelation, just a few weeks from now, where John concludes the whole story of the Bible with an invitation that seems to just continually remain on offer at the end of the story, where he writes this. He says, "Let anyone who desires come and drink freely from the water of life." Let anyone who desires drink freely from the water of life. And friends, that is the invitation for us today, and the invitation of Revelation chapter 20, that what we see in this picture, this good versus evil vision from John, is that whether through fire or water, or more accurately, through the person and work of Jesus, that at times gets described as both in the story so far of what Jesus has already accomplished, and in the story to come of what God is still to do through Jesus. From the third chapter of the Bible to the third last, what we see is that God is only, ever, always in the process of offering life to creation, in the process of renewing and restoring and refreshing and redeeming creation in a way that can have good triumph over evil, all as part of God's first promise that goodness will win the day over evil once and for all in the story that he is telling in the world. Friends, this is the good news of Revelation chapter 20 today. So then I suppose that the final question for this morning is, what about your story? What about my story? And what about our stories altogether? And how might God be inviting us today to trust our stories with his story? Trust that God through Jesus has overcome evil and now wants to be delivering our lives from evil as well. That we are now empowered to choose good and resist evil. The New Testament says that God will never put in front of us any temptation that we can't overcome by his Spirit and by his power. And that then God has given us a role to play, again, in choosing good, to be a part of establishing the goodness of his kingdom here on earth as in heaven. And that we can trust the fullness of God's story. Trust that evil and death do not get the last word, but that God's eternal gift of life through Jesus can redeem and restore and renew and forgive any deed that we've ever done. And again, so here and now in our lives, we can be a part of bringing that redemption and forgiveness into the lives of others, forgiving others just as God has forgiven us. That we can trust our story with God's story in this way. And friends, what's beautiful today is that not only is that our invitation, but that we get to celebrate that in the stories and lives of a number of people across our community who have recently done just that, who have put their trust of their story in the goodness of God's story and are experiencing a renewal and refreshment and a change, a good versus evil winning in their lives in a fresh way that we get to hear and celebrate today. And not only do we get to hear their stories, but then we get to celebrate with them in a couple of our locations through the life-giving waters of baptism. A beautiful symbol and reminder of all that God has done in Jesus and that in Christ, good ultimately triumphs over evil. So may we know the goodness of God's story. And may we trust our lives and our stories with his. And may we choose good and resist evil and be a part of seeing God's kingdom of goodness and love come in the world today. Let's check out these baptism stories together.